Good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining the Shelterbelts and Perennial Vegetation webinar. For those who may not know me, my name is Marla Carlson, and I'm the Executive Director at Sask Organics, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm speaking to you today from Regina, Saskatchewan, situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nahiawak, the Ashinepek, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And just a little background, if you are an organic producer, in the organic standards under section 5.24, there's a recommendation for management practices to include measures to promote and protect ecosystem health on the operation and incorporate one or more of the following features: pollinator habitat, insectary areas, wildlife habitat, maintenance or restoration of riparian areas or wetlands, or other measures which promote biodiversity. Existing native prairie, parkland, or wetland habitats should be maintained and enhanced wherever possible. Shelter belts or perennial vegetation pollinator strips are two great ways to increase these areas, and our speakers today are going to share with us some research and information about these and their many benefits. And so before we get going, I'm just going to go through a bit of housekeeping. Many of you have been on many webinars throughout the pandemic, but it's always good just to have a little refresher, because it seems that every platform is just a little bit different. So what we recommend is that you close down any unnecessary programs that might be running in the background, especially if you're having issues with the video or audio quality. Attendees are all in listen-only mode. Only moderators and panelists can speak. However, you can ask your questions by using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you are joining us by phone, you will have been prompted to enter an audio PIN after joining the webinar. If you didn't enter the PIN, please ensure your phone is muted at all times, just to stop any sort of background noise coming through. There will be time to answer questions from the audience, and but time is always limited on these things, and we'll do the best to answer as many as we can. The webinar is being recorded. Attendees will receive an email link within a day of the live webinar. Some of our sponsors have also provided handouts. Those will also be included in your email. And finally, please bear with us, as sometimes we have technical glitches, no matter how many we've done. So we'll do our best to make this run as smoothly as possible for you today. And of course, we can't do what we do without our sponsors. So a big shout out to our gold sponsor, Grain Millers, ProCert, and to our bronze sponsors, the Organic Crop Improvement Association International and Weed Surfer. Thank you so much. And I'll just say a little bit about Sask Organics. For those who aren't familiar, we are the industry association for certified organic farmers and processors in the province. We're a farmer-led nonprofit. We represent 941 organic crop producers, and there are 1,052 certified organic entities in the province. And there are 1.036 million acres under organic management, which represents about 30% of all organic acres in Canada. And now on to what you've all joined us to hear, our presentations and presenters. So we'll start off with Colin Larocque. He's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Colin, he specializes in dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, and climate analysis, and headed a great project out of the Mad Lab at the U of S that helps producers or landowners learn the carbon and economic value of the shelter belts, as well as a planning tool to help design shelter belts for your land. Please join me in welcoming Colin Larocque.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. Oops, wrong click. There you go. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I really am excited to talk to sort of like-minded individuals, landowners, owners of organic farming, people who care a little bit more about the environment from different perspectives. And so I hope at least that this talk will be beneficial for you. We've been working on shelter belts in our sort of scientific aspects for at least the last decade, 12, 14 years, sort of working with it, trying to learn more about them. And we've studied many different aspects of shelter belts. But what we have done in the last 5 years is that, you know, we can publish all the papers we want, but we weren't really getting our information out to the producers, to the landowners. And so what we decided to do is create a shelter belt decision support system, a DSS, some kind of tool that we could get out to the producers and help them, because each and every individual out there has a very distinct kind of landscape, and they have a different process of treating their shelter belts and looking at them. And so what we wanted to do is make an all-encompassing location where people could go and learn about their shelter belts, whether it's more for wildlife habitat or just visual aesthetics. Everyone has some beautiful shelter belts around their homesteads, and those are the kinds of things that people treasure, and yet we weren't really incorporating things into it too much. What we decided to do is we really wanted to kind of capture some of the buzzwords that you've heard in the last 5 or 6 years, especially when the idea of a federal carbon tax was starting to come on into play. These ideas of you know, carbon and what are carbon and how bad they were going to be for farmers. It really set up that scenario where, you know, like Saskatchewan really wasn't part of the group. And in fact, we took the federal government to court, and they ended up making their own plan, the Saskatchewan Prairie Resilience Plan, and then the Saskatchewan Growth Plan, where it was almost at odds against the federal carbon tax. Part of that was because the carbon tax itself was seen as the negative aspects, all the bad things that are happening, and we got to tax those things. But we were on the other side saying, you know what, the farmers are out there growing things, and growing things like trees is a wonderful way of putting a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere back into a long-term storage. And so there's a lot of benefits out there that weren't being talked about, and that's where we wanted to come in. If you looked at something like, some of the words in things like the Saskatchewan Growth Plan, you know, you'd see things like focusing on investments into carbon sequestrations. And we were knowing that anybody who has shelter belts existing on the property, they have been sequestering carbon for as long as those trees have been growing. If they kept trees growing on there, they're sequestering carbon in the woody biomass that you see in the tree, but also in the soil around it. So these are the kinds of things that we wanted to actually put numbers on and then try to somehow share it with everybody who's using it. Other things that they have in this is like contributions that are not being recognized through the federal carbon tax. Again, that really hit what we were trying to do. These trees are sequestering carbon every year on a shelter belt system and on a farm. And we went out and we measured, and there's 61,000 kilometers of shelter belts in just Saskatchewan. 61,000 kilometers of shelter belts all the way along that we've planted, you know, close to 1 billion trees in Saskatchewan. None of those are being counted. None of them were counted in the federal kind of carbon auditing system, because we're in the prairies. There's no trees here mentality. And so we're saying, no, there is. And we're actually sequestering a lot of carbon, but we're not getting any credit for it. So this is how we wanted to try to change that. We wanted to take that shelter belts that are there, taking up their carbon storage and all these other benefits that we get. You know, they're slowing the wind, they're stopping pesticide drift, they're making housing more efficient by like less heating energy. There's a lot of economic and then social benefits for all the people of the prairies and all the people of Canada that these farmers and landowners are doing by keeping their shelter belts, and yet none of the credit was coming to them. So this is what we set out to do, to take all of our science from the last decade and put it into some kind of mechanism that other people can use. And the most important, we were building a tool to help give this to the farmers and the landowners, but most importantly, as it turns out, probably the government, because the government were the ones who are having the hard time. They're the ones who are switching every 4 years when there's a new election, yet the farmers are in place knowing what they have all along. So before, I want to just show you some pictures. We send out many students, and we have a huge team behind what I'm going to be showing you today. Computer programmers, modelers, people who looked at the soil, people who look at the above ground biomass, the trees, how fast they're growing, climate change experts, how are trees going to grow in the future based on how they've grown in the past. And so there's many students and many types of measurements we've made in the past. Everything from these field shelter belts like you see in the background to the ones around the farms, the ones around the homes and the corral systems and the cattle pens. Those ones are all beneficial, and we tried to measure all of them across the province. I'll give you an example. We started out with some of the more common species. We usually did it in soil zones across Saskatchewan. So the gray at the north, working down to the black and the dark brown and the brown, all the way through across the areas of Saskatchewan. And we went out looking for all these different species. These trees have been planted since the early 1900s, but we kind of measured all ages, all locations, and this is a map for a bunch of our locations for white spruce to give you an example. And this is that southern sort of 1/3 of Saskatchewan is where we spent most of our time. The kinds of things we studied, all kinds of species, 6 main species, some deciduous or some broadleaf and some conifers. So, like the spruce, the white spruce, the pine. We studied carigana for shrubs. We studied Manitoba maple, green ash. We took the 6 most common tree species that were given out to landowners free, and we tried to study those. We couldn't do all the species that they had, but we tried to do the most common ones, the ones that are most easily seen across the landscape. And then we measured them. We took samples of them. We got farmers to donate trees. We cut them down and we weighed all these different trees and tree species in these different soil zones and climate zones to see how the trees were reacting. We went out and we took increment cores, small little pencil-like cores that these students are taking, and we took them out because they will tell us how that tree has grown through time. The other thing that we wanted to do is much of the legislation is the governments will draw a line in the sand and they'll say, okay, everything from 2020 onward will start to count. But we know that these trees have been growing for a long period of time. And so what we did with our experiments is we went back to an annual scale. Year by year, these trees are producing carbon. And because of our winters in Saskatchewan, we have an ability to say, okay, that was this year, that was this calendar year, let's go to the next year. And with the tree rings, if everybody's ever sat around a fire and seen the tree rings in a piece of wood, we're able to do that year by year. And this is actually something special, and we can monitor and model everything year by year so that you wouldn't have to cut down a shelter belt to plant a new one to get a carbon credit or to get a government credit. You could just keep growing your existing trees that are very healthy, doing well, and you could hopefully get carbon credits for that. We worked out a way to do that. Okay, so after we gained all this information, we just usually put everything into these computers, gave it to our computer modeling teams. They modeled everything, and then we tried to publish it and communicate to the landowners, but that didn't work that well. Again, too fancy of a science, and it didn't work. So we'd go to like agribitions or the farm shows, and we would actually show them our model and say, okay, can you come and use it? Can you tell us what works for you? What doesn't work? How should we make it so that you would use it more? And we went through a couple of these iterations using just landowners at farm shows to give us feedback, and we created our online model. I'm going to take you through the model and kind of show you where it is in a few minutes here. But before I do that, I just want to show you roughly all of these dots on the map. These are all the locations that we've went to across our study that we've had for about a decade. So we tried to hit all these soil zones in all these places, but we randomized everything so that it's a good kind of scientific study, randomized across these landscapes. So certain areas have a lot more dots, but that's just how it worked out. And then we've crossed all the climate zones from some of the drier areas, the wetter areas, the colder areas, the hotter areas across the province. And lastly, I think most people in this kind of audience will know, but I usually introduce this, just so that you know, like a multiple row of shelter belts. This is kind of like a hybrid poplar row of very older trees, and then younger trees on the side coming in this green ash, baby rows of green ash. And so that would be like a 2-row system, and you'll see that in our model how we use that. How many rows do you have at your site, or how many do you want to plant? And then some of the other kind of lingo we'll use is we usually take the diameter. We measure how fat around are your trees growing. We use diameter in our modeling, but we've converted that because the landowners were telling us it's easier. Just tell me how far around and I can probably do that. And in this case, Brooke is taking a little white spruce and she's saying how far around is it. And we usually go 1.3 meters above the ground, or about shoulder height. And we get a measurement of your tree there if you're going to do an evaluation. The other thing on the right you'll see is that, spacing. So you can see multiple trees and 2 rows of white spruce. So, if you're going to take an average circumference of your trees, we usually ask that you'll go into a row and take, 2 or 3 or 4 measurements and average them out. And same with spacing. You can see sort of spacing here that these trees are sort of spaced at on a distance that's uniform, more or less. And so you'd measure a multiple to see how far apart. And these ones look, 2 or 3 meters apart. And so that matters because it matters how they grow through time. The same thing here, where you can kind of see I have some black arrows and some white arrows, and these are 2 rows, but they're offset. So they're offset and staggered. So it's kind of like a continuous wall of spruce, but the white row is in front, and they're planted maybe 5 or 6 meters apart, 6 meters probably here, with another row offset in the background, and they're planted 6 meters apart. But there's a uniform distance, and we usually would ask landowners to measure, to say in general, they're 4 or 5 meters apart, or 6 meters, or 2.5 meters, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you to our Shelterbelt decision support system, and we'll walk through it. So here's the link to it, so anybody can go, and hopefully we can share that. We have a website that we use. Quite a few of our information's at our Sask Agroforestry website, so we have fact sheets, and a lot of our more technical information is there if you want to look into it. And we also have our own Shelterbelt email that we can do. Okay, so I'm just going to open up my browser, and again, hopefully everything is works well. But if you click on our Sask Shelterbelt, you'll get to our website. It's our decision support system. We can have, agroforestry in Saskatchewan, Shelterbelt database where we can have a bunch of our data in there, the Shelterbelt planner, and then some reference guides that we have, and lots of information in here. But I'm only going to take you to these 2 sections today, Shelterbelt planner. And if you click on this button, you'll come to 2 aspects, either a Shelterbelt planning tool or a current Shelterbelt evaluation tool. So this is if you want to grow something new, you can plan now, or if you have something already and you want to learn more about, especially the carbon in here, you can click that button. So I think we'll go to, let's say, plan now. So what it does when you click plan now, you come up to, you can turn on this drawing tool, and you can see there's a little blue dot moving around. We have video tutorials. If you don't know how to use it, you can click on this video tutorials. Up will come a whole bunch of videos, video by video, and you can just click it and they'll show you, and they'll take you through how to use the whole system, one click at a time. We go back. Okay, yeah, we're back on the thing. Everything's working well. So we have to go to a location, and in this case, you can put in a city or a tree, latitude, longitude, or your legal description, and click search, and it'll go to that site. In this case, because we usually do something in Saskatchewan, at least Regina versus Saskatoon, we'll just kind of click here, Regina. You can see it just zooms you right into Regina. There's the city of Regina. If you zoom out with your mouse, you can kind of see, but it took you to the center of Regina. And here's Mosaic Stadium, or the old Taylor Field. So we'll kind of zoom into that location. And if we want to pretend to draw, I don't know, a shelter belt around Mosaic Stadium, we could do that. We could click here to draw, so we can just kind of go around here, pretend that we wanted to draw something here. You can make any shape you kind of want, just going click by click. And if we were to put rows of Shelterbelt, oops, I clicked one too many times. I have to do it again. If you wanted to put some rows of Shelterbelts around Mosaic Stadium, and it's a double click at the end. Oh, classic. If I had a student here showing you that, I get it the first time. There we go. Okay, so there's where you pretend you want to plan. You can clear the drawing if it's not where you want, or you can click plan your Shelterbelt. And what this will do is take all of our information that we've gained from around Regina and give you an idea of what you might want to do. Instantly up will come all these graphs telling you all these different things. Now in our case up here, optimal species for your area, and you can see anytime there's a little question mark, you can see it'll give you a bar or a box will come up explaining to you what we mean. You'll see them kind of located area, which type of Shelterbelts. Well, there's a farm and a field Shelterbelt. Everything's kind of alive. If you go over there in this area, most of the Shelterbelts around the farm, there's a 96% in the Regina area around the farms, with only 6% around along in the fields. And it'll tell you what we have in our whole inventory. And it'll give you all this information about what's happening around Regina. But most importantly, over here, it allows you to select your species. In this case, just drop down menus. I've picked 2 species. How many rows? 2 rows. In one row, I want to put white spruce and another green ash. And then I'll hit calculate, and it'll usually pop this up. It's already calculated it. It's kind of that fast. So here you can say the suitability for white spruce is average, so 0.4 to 0.6 for your location. You go, what does that mean? You can hit this and it'll say from 0 to 1. So 0 is very unsuitable and 1 being very good. And then you can see green ash is 0.6 to 0.8. So green ash is going to be better for that location than white spruce. You can go in there and see that kind of thing here, where in the region, in the area, most people, 63% have deciduous, where some of them are conifers, about 20%, and about 20% shrubs. And for shrubs are 17. Most of that is usually carragana. So, you know, these are the kinds of evergreen broadleaves, and it kind of gives you an idea what most other people have growing there, and it matches kind of what's up here. The conditions and how well they're doing health-wise is quite good. Everything's doing quite well right now for the existing Shelterbelts. Shelterbelts width, how many rows? Most are 1 and 2 road systems around Regina. Straight L-shaped, you know, most of them again are straight, 42%. Most of them, even the directions, cardinal directions, most are going north-south or east-west. You know, they're usually following along that kind of square pattern of our mile-by-mile system. And the ages of most Shelterbelts and where they are in raw numbers. And this is all coming from the databases sent out from Indian Head of where they sent trees to what location. So we've kind of condensed all that and put it into one mapping system. So you'll know what people in your region did. And if you were to make these two kind of graphs, what it would look like. So you can hit the continue button and just move on. And here's the best practices for what it is. For our planned Shelterbelt around Mosaic, you know, you would take up 5.16 acres away from that field, or this many square meters away, based on your design of 2 rows for that length. That length we had was 1.31 kilometers long. And to fit that many trees, if you wanted a white spruce and you wanted to design them, you'd need 373 white spruce. We recommend that you plant them 3.5 meters apart based on how they grow in your area. And then the suitability is in this average or low area. Compare that to, let's say, green ash, which you'd need 522 green ash if you were to order them. We recommend you plant them 2.5 meters apart. And then it's stronger suitability for them growing into the future, growing now and growing into the future. If you keep moving down here, you'll see some kind of scales here where the tree growth scales on one side The timeline is across here. And what we do is we show you how, in this case, white spruce has grown in the past around Regina. One is being average, above one is above average, below is below average. And you can see that we take these usually from as far back as we can, in this case 1950, and we usually stop at 2010. And at 2010, we start predicting how they'll go in the future by global climate models. We use two scenarios, a kind of normal scenario of where we're at, and then a scenario of a more extreme weather as you go farther in the future. And you can see this is between 2 and -1, and you can see the white spruce in this case starting to do not as well in Regina. And as you move forward in time, here's the 0 line, and it starts to become really bad. In fact, somewhere in here in 2050, many of these white spruce will start to die out. And it doesn't matter if you're in the normal or the extreme climate change. This is the two lines. It gets pretty dire by 2100. These trees are going to have a very hard time to grow. It's supposed to be very hot, very dry in that area. And the conifer, which is more adapted to things like the boreal forest to the north, isn't going to do very well. You could switch it over to green ash. You can see now, here's the scale changes, how the trees have been growing in the past, how they'll grow in the future. They'll still be well above 0. They'll still be doing quite well. And it's not until the last, 2080, 2100 that they start to do poorly. It gets a little too hot and a little too dry for even green ash. So that's the kind of thing where you can play, change your species, see how they're going for your planned area. And we hope it kind of conveys that information and gives you something to make a decision on of what you might want to plant now, or what we have existing now, and when would we maybe want to take it down and plant a new one, and what generation of the farm would be using it moving forward. If we hit continue one more time, we can get into the same type of thing, but now we're saying how much stored carbon is in there, how much of the carbon will be increasing from species throughout the species. And we're seeing here carbon on this side, CO2 equivalent, and through time. And then again, various climate scenarios, a normal and an extreme climate scenario. And you can see the normal does better, and the more extreme it gets is the one lower. You can look at all the carbon in your system, or you can just look at the dead organic matter. So this is the building up, the leaves, the needles dropping off, the branches dropping off. What rate do they drop off through time? And how do you build up that carbon in the dead organic matter? That's still, we still have been able to measure. After 20 or 30 years, it starts to build up, and you start to get a bonus from that. You can hit the annual carbon increase, seeing how much it changes from year to year in just the dead organic matter or for the live carbon. And again, what many people care about is your dollar value. The dollar value of this carbon through time. And this is an annual value in dollars, in Canadian dollars. And we go with the federal thing. So right now in 2021, the federal is $40 per ton of carbon. And so we can calculate that throughout. And you can kind of see how much the value of your potentially planted shelter belt will be over time. So, after 42 years, it'd be roughly worth, $8,000 for the white spruce. So it's not too much. For the green ash, after 42 years, if you went up here, it would be 5,000. Those are the kinds of things that you would get out of the model. We've calculated all for you. Hopefully you can follow it. And the other thing is, some people care about our carbon footprint. So we put this carbon calculator down here again, and this is how much it takes to plant. So planting this shelter belt will consume approximately 4.929 tons of carbon, including seedling development, transportation, and planting. The closest hub to get it for you for pickup would be Regina. So in most cases, we grow the trees in this case, in the Shan greenhouse by Estevan. We transport them by truck. We calculated all the costs of going into growing that in a carbon footprint and then transporting them to Regina. Again, it gives you the information that you can use if you feel like it. And the last step is a printing page or a summary page. So you can print this off all that information you have, any kind of the maps we made for you, you could print them off, and all of your information there. Okay, so I can see my time slipping by, so we're going to quickly go back to the DSS, go back to the planner, and I just want to quickly show you an evaluation tool. In this case, I'll go to my home area in Duck Lake. You just let the map go to wherever you want. There's the swinging metropolis of Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. I'm just going to go a little north of town here to a site that we went to quite a bit. I zoom in a bit at this farm, and you can see here we have some field shelter belts, or field shelter belts with the really crazy kind of designs in them. And in this case, we use this one quite a bit, where it's some green ash and white spruce along a railway track. We draw them out again, clear the drawing. You can pick any of the locations, the same as the other aspect, and then evaluate. So these are existing shelter belts, and a landowner who lives here might say, what's that shelter belt doing for me? You can go in here again, pick how many rows, so 2 rows of white spruce and a green ash, and I pick somewhere fairly north of Regina here now, so we're closer to Prince Albert. I pre-planned this in because I knew my time was going to be in, so 86 centimeter circumference, a 48 centimeter circumference for that. We'd calculate that. Here's where we put in the tons, so currently the dollars per ton is $40 per ton, so I put that in. I knew the age of 68. Mortality is how many trees would die. So we'd usually count 10 and say how many are dying. So in this case, 1.5 out of 10 or 2 out of 20 would be 15%. Spacing was 5 meters. The green ash spacing was 2.5 meters. Mortality 1 in 10 has died. You submit that and it crashed. Okay. Let's see if I can just do Caragana. Age is 24, spacing is 2, quality is 10. Oh, there you go. Okay, so I got the Caragana to work. Up will come instantly how old the Caragana. In our case, I told it that it's 24 years old, so this is how old it is, and this is how the Caragana will act through time. Again, the same scenarios, 2 climate change scenarios, you can toggle back and forth. You can do various things, and again, live with the roots and all the properties of the tree trunk, the branches, leaves, and roots. The dead organic matter is here, and the total ecosystem carbon. We have quite a few things on these maps, so the people who came through our system says, don't give it to us all at once, let me turn it on and off if I want. A 0 here, or a round circle, is the regional average, and your shelter belt is a triangle. So you can, for example, turn on just the triangles, and you can see toggle along. Here's your live carbon year by year, age 51, age 49. You can go over to the dead organic matter, how that accumulates through time underneath these Caraganas, or else the total ecosystem carbon at your age. You can switch this to dollar value again. And again, the scale will change, and it'll start to give you a carbon value. You can toggle on anything all the way up to all 6 of these events, where you can sort of see all the different kind of modules that you may or may not use, or you can change them. And this is all giving you information about your existing dollar values and your existing how much carbon is located at your site. Okay, so I want to just go back. This is sort of my end, I think, of my time. So I just wanted to say that, this is a tool for you to play with. We've shared it with the government. We share it with many farmers. It's free. It's available. All of our science is in there. You can just go to the shelterbelt-sk.ca and play away. Go to your own farm and see what you have. And a lot of our information that we can have is on our various websites, but mainly on the Sask Agroforestry website. Okay, so I think that's roughly my time. So I don't know if there's any questions or if people have any questions, but I'd be very happy to answer them.
Right, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. That was a really informative presentation. I came across the tool. It was probably in a Western Producer article a while back, and I just thought, wow, this is, how can we help to, in a sense, spread the word about this? And I think especially as you mentioned for organic producers, I mean, there is a requirement to have some eco acres and biodiversity on our farms, and to be able to calculate, this is it's like almost like the holy grail, right? To actually be able to calculate your not only the carbon footprint, which I thought was interesting, so you understand the impact of the carbon impact of what you're doing, but also the benefit, both in carbon and dollars, and that's what farmers are going to want to know. And of course, 61,000, what was it, 61,000 kilometers of trees, and again, it's just like another very Saskatchewan stereotype, like you said, like there are no trees in Saskatchewan. It's like, well, start traveling north in the province first.
Yeah.
Get off the number one, and secondly, there are trees in the south, and so to have that kind of number as well to be able to share, I think is great. And then I'm always happy to hear there's benefits of winter, right? Being able to get that annual measurement makes the minus 35 days a little easier. So I do have one question. Well, a couple of questions actually. The first one is, since the PFRA program is no longer in place, are there sources of free or inexpensive trees for Shelterbelts?
Yeah, so on our Sask Agroforestry website and the Shelterbelt, we put them too. We've kind of created a list. There's some, we've got the Alberta, the Manitoba, and the Saskatchewan, but we end up with very few of them. Once the Indian Head closed down, there's nothing, and that was free. And so that was a really great price for anybody. But now the cheapest is to go to like usually Shan Greenhouse in Estevan is where you get most of them that in Saskatchewan, or at least the bulk. But I don't know, some of you may have heard in the news this idea of when Greta Thunberg came around and Trudeau met her and he said, okay, we're going to plant 2 billion trees, right? Well, as soon as that happened, the people in the Federal Forestry Division, they asked, can we do that? Is there actually enough capacity to even create 2 million seedlings a year, or 20 million seedlings, or 200 million seedlings a year?
Yeah.
Because to get to 2 billion, that's such a huge number. It sounds not a big deal because it's probably our national debt numbers, but it's actually really hard. There's no the physical places to grow this many seedlings are really not out there. But instantly it started all these other companies. So there's companies in British Columbia that nurseries who make trees saying, well, where are they going to get their 2 billion for Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta? Maybe we should expand there. Because again, they can't plant a BC tree here and expect it to grow right away. So usually you try to get your stock from what's adapted to this landscape, or what's going to be adapted to this landscape 50, 60, 80, 100 years from now. So it started quite a bit. There still is no one else really making too much. There was a couple First Nation groups. Carry the Kettle, I think, has talked a lot with the Indian Head facility, because that facility is still there. It's ready to go. They have the land, they have the equipment. So it'd be really nice if it really came back to life, but very rare in the government world, from one ruling party to another ruling party, that they go back and switch each other's decisions too often, right? They'd rather start new, and then they can have a better press release about something new, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that there is, when that announcement was made about the 2 billion trees, there was a government program created, but I think, a part of it, I believe from memory, was to encourage, I guess, the development, or to build the capacity to actually grow these trees. So, again, it's sort of watch this space, I think, for the development of that program, for sure. It's not a question, but it's more of a comment. One of the things that I really liked when you were demonstrating the tool was that to be able to see visually the impact of climate change, like in 2100. What is this going to look like? Because I think part of the inaction around putting in mitigating measures is that it's really hard for humans to go, oh yeah, in 2100, it's just hard, right, to visualize or conceptualize sometimes. And, you know, just to be able to see that, I think really, at least it helped me, right? It's like, whoa, like this, we're in trouble. And this is just like one little area, you know,
Exactly. And
in Regina.
with our tool, you could go down to, let's say, you know, a Maple Creek, let's say, and say, oh, I'm going to plant something down here, and say, I'm going to plant a conifer, and it'll show you really quickly. It's you can't. It's almost impossible to grow a conifer down there. So you have to get a tree that's adapted for further south, like a green ash, maybe a maple, and then you move up to Regina, or you move further north, and you try to keep planting as you're going, and the trees get better and better and better and better, and it kind of shows you, you know, 60 years from now, 80 years from now, you won't be able to grow some of these things in certain locations based on our climate projections. And again, we try to give you that sort of middle of the road and an extreme. Again, at first we had too many options, and the landowner was going, that's just too much. Just give me, you know, an extreme one and where we think it is. And then depending on who you believe in the climate world, we're already probably past all the extremes. So even our extremes of our models, we probably have already gonna surpass them because we just can't catch up.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, thank you again. And, you know, the thought that just popped into my head is, you know, when we were just talking about government funding and, you know, changing, you know, political parties and that sort of thing, I just really hope that your project is financially supported and that, you know, it continues, because it's just going to become increasingly important, you know, as we, you know, go along this road. Yeah.
I mean, just quickly for you guys in the world, I mean, our next step is to put a monetary value on the aesthetics, or monetary value on pollinators, or a monetary value on, you know, habitat for birds and wildlife in these shelter belts. Because right now, it's so important, but there's no way to put a price on that. So that's our next step. But you're right, we have to get funded, otherwise we can't have anyone studying it. So we hope.
I know. So here's, let us know if you need any letters of support, or
okay.
We'll be more than happy to support in any way that we can. So thank you again so much for being here with us today. And yeah, we will do our best to you know, to promote the tool and bring it to the attention of our members. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. So we are going to move on to our next presentation, Jason Gibbs. So Jason has presented with us before. You might have seen his presentation, Bees Knees, the Pollinator webinar in 2020. He is an assistant professor of entomology at the University of Manitoba. His research relates to biodiversity of wild bees and how to support them in agricultural systems. He is currently leading a research project funded through the Organic Science Cluster that hopes to quantify the impact of management practices that support biodiversity in agricultural systems, and to build resiliency into these systems to protect them from changing conditions and pest outbreaks. Thank you for being with us here again today, Jason, and over to you. Oh, and I think you're on mute. Oh.
Okay, I think that.
There we go, perfect. We can hear you, awesome.
And you can see my screen, I hope?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Well, I really enjoyed that talk by Colin. That was amazing. We're doing something a little bit different. We're using sort of flowering plant species. And we're sort of focused in on the benefits they have for insects. But they also have a lot of other sort of potential benefits in terms of, you know, soil erosion, control, sort of maintaining waterways, carbon sequestration, but we're not really looking at those. We're just sort of focused mostly on the beneficial insect side. I'm a bee person, as was mentioned. But there's a whole host of different kinds of insects that are beneficial in agricultural systems. So bees pollinate. There are a lot of predatory insects that are feeding on pest insects. They're also sort of feeding on weed seeds. So there's all these sort of hosts of different insects that we want to support in agriculture. And so the idea with our project is try to implement some of these habitat strips, try to encourage these different insects, and then we're sort of monitoring those. So we're monitoring primarily wild bees, hoverflies, which are pollinators as adults and predators as larvae, and also ground beetles, which do a variety of different things. A lot of them are predators, but some of them also feed on weed seeds. And we're also looking at the potential sort of disservices that these sort of strips might present. So we're also looking at weed pressure that's coming off of these strips, and also monitoring some of the key pests. But I'm mostly just going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits, and then also some of the challenges with implementing these. So the idea of supporting beneficial insects is theoretically it's fairly simple. I mean, you want to give them something to eat. So these flowers provide a lot of that for most of these insects. You want to give them somewhere to live. So a lot of bees actually nest in the ground. So this is sort of providing some undisturbed habitat for them to find nests. And then you're looking for a place where they can sort of thrive and survive and avoid sort of being killed. So particularly in conventional systems, where there might be some insecticide use, this provides sort of a place where they can sort of avoid those sorts of toxic treatments. So it's fairly simplistic. There's a few different ways of sort of providing habitat for beneficial insects. In a way, the easiest thing is to just retain any habitat that's already existing. So if you have a shelter belt, if you have a sort of a wetland area, just sort of leave it in place, and that will provide certain benefits. There's certain opportunity costs associated with that. So, obviously land that's sort of put in place for these sorts of habitats is not land that you can crop on. And that's true of all these sorts of different options. The strategy that we're sort of taking is one of sort of augmentation. So we're sort of putting these habitat strips next to crop fields. So there's those opportunity costs, but there's also sort of an investment in seeds. There's different ways of doing that. So you can use perennial crops, so sort of like a one-time investment in seeds, and if it establishes, then it sort of takes care of itself. Or there's potential options to sort of do a more sort of annual temporary system where you're sort of planting sort of cheaper seeds periodically. A more extensive way of doing this would be just try to restore habitat to a sort of a natural state. And that requires a lot more investment in doing that sort of system. So we're sort of focused on something that's a little bit easier agronomically to just sort of augment the edge of crop fields. This next slide, I sort of borrowed this from a recent paper that came out a week or two ago. So it's a bit busy, but it sort of illustrates some of the different options that are available. This came out of the University of Calgary, and it's sort of focused mostly on sort of a pothole region, which is why you see all these little water spots. So there's different sort of strategies that you can implement. So you have some shelter belts, mostly on sort of the left. You have sort of in the upper right, you can sort of just retain any of these sorts of existing habitats that might be present. You can augment them in a couple of different ways. So in the upper right, you have this option of sort of augmenting using sort of maybe intercropping with a flowering species, or you might use sort of cover crops, sort of either before or after your main crop as a way to sort of provide additional resources for beneficial insects when your crop is not in bloom. But the strategy that we are sort of taking is sort of in the bottom left, which is this idea of having sort of a linear strip at the edge of the crop field. So this might be taking a little bit of land out of production, or you might be converting sort of a grassy margin to a flower strip. And then sort of the idea of this is sort of in the sort of center left, is that you're either providing a reservoir for these insects to sort of survive, or you're maybe aggregating them, sort of getting them to come to your field. And then the hope is that they will then sort of thrive in that area, but then sort of spill over into the crop, and thereby providing pollination services or preying on any sort of pest insects that might be in the field. So the goals of our project were basically to sort of support these sort of beneficial insects. We're sort of monitoring these different categories of insects. Ideally, we'd like to increase crop yields, although we'd probably be happy if they were neutral, as long as they're just not costing the farmer anything. And the plants that we chose to use were sort of a mix of annuals and perennials. We used some tame perennials and some native perennials, and we're planting these in about 1 to 3 acre strips located on the field edges. In an ideal scenario, I'd probably want to plant, it's just a series of native perennial plants, but those seeds are much more expensive and they're less available. So there isn't really a market, there aren't enough nurseries producing enough seed to make that really an option at this stage. So we're sort of using this sort of other sort of mix. I should acknowledge that this is sort of a team effort as well. So there's some plant scientists and some entomologists working on this, but the person who's really out in the field on a daily basis collecting insects is this graduate student of mine, Michael Killewald. So he's out there surveying in various ways using different kinds of traps, netting insects, so collecting all these different sort of categories of insects as well. And so, the basic idea, which has been shown in other sort of agricultural systems, that wildflower strips work. They're actually good for insects. It's not too surprising that if you plant flowers, you'll find bees. And so we found similar results. So if you have these flower strips and you compare them to crop field edges that don't have strips, you'll see more bees, you'll see more ground beetles in the flower strips. The hoverflies are a little bit more of a mixed response. So there's actually a very abundant small group of hoverflies that like to feed on aphids as a larva, and they're actually very happy on grassy margins. So they actually do pretty well on the grass that aren't enhanced. This is the only sort of data sort of slide to sort of support that. So these are just sort of the numbers of bees that we collected with some nets on the left, and then ground beetles that we collected in pit bull traps on the right. And so there's just a fairly obvious difference in the numbers that we see in these sort of two different categories of edges. Now, we actually saw this effect almost immediately, which leads me to believe this is not a situation where the bees and the ground beetles were sort of building up over populations, that they were instead sort of being attracted to these field edges and sort of aggregating there. And so it'll be a longer term study to sort of see whether or not those populations actually increase across the whole landscape. In terms of site preparation, this is definitely the most important thing to consider if you're interested in implementing one of these strips. It's very important to kill any sort of weed seeds that might be present and not to rush it. One of the detriments of doing this is sort of as a scientific study is that you're sort of bound to this sort of duration of a research grant. So you're trying to actively get things into the ground as fast as possible. But you probably want to take your time. You might want to take 1 year, 2 years, however, to sort of prepare that area to make sure that it's going to be the most successful. A couple of options. One is to sort of till that ground, get rid of everything. Another option that some people will use is called solarization. So you put these plastic sheets over the area that you want to plant a strip in, and that sort of helps all the existing plants germinate, but then it bakes them and sort of kills them off. And then once you've done that, you don't want to disturb the soil anymore. You want to sort of leave it intact so you're not bringing more weed seeds up to germinate. Another option is to use a nurse crop. So you sort of plant something that you can control that will just sort of cover the entire area and sort of crowd out any of those weeds. And then you can sort of control that nurse crop, cut it off before it goes to seed, and then give your target plants, your perennial species, an opportunity to put some roots down and then sort of come up. And then once those are established, they'll take care of themselves and help crowd out any weeds. One thing that's a little bit different from traditional farming is that you might be using a mixture of different seeds. So you have different seeds of different sizes. So you just want to take that into consideration in what planter you're choosing. A lot of the perennial native species don't want to be put too deeply in the soil. So you might even broadcast them and then use some sort of light harrow to sort of get some soil contact, but you're trying not to disturb the soil again. Or sort of a very shallow drill just to put them, a centimeter down and plant them that way. So with the perennials, you don't want them getting too deep, otherwise they won't germinate and come up. Definitely the most challenging aspect of this kind of habitat enhancement is just getting establishment. So every site is different. They have different sort of weed pressures, they have different sort of soil moistures, and so you're never entirely sure whether or not it's going to work well or it's going to require more effort. This one has a lot of dead sort of plant cover over top, but actually in this sort of dry climate that we've had the last couple of years, it's actually not too bad necessarily for germination because it's going to create sort of a humid environment for those seedlings, as long as it's not too thick. So you actually sort of see some of our planted species here, Same Point and Phacelia and Big Blue Stem, also some weeds sort of coming up, so we're going to want to control those. But with the perennials, they're fairly resilient, so especially the natives, they're going to be putting roots down the first year. And so one of the key things to do is to manage these for weeds is to sort of just regularly mow them at sort of a decent height, 15, 20 centimeters. Anytime you see weeds sort of becoming dominant or getting tall, you sort of chop off those seed heads so they don't go to seed, and your perennials will be able to handle getting a little bit of a cut, because they're just going to put all their resources down into those roots, and they'll just come back stronger later. So some of the challenges that we face in this project is partially sort of out of our control. So it's very dry last couple of years, which created some problems for seed germination. We've done some spring seeding, and again, sort of when you have a dry spring, that makes it challenging. We've also tried fall seeding as well. We did that last year and got stuck a little bit because we put the seeds down sort of once the weather had sort of cooled off, and was sort of relative, so that they wouldn't germinate. But then after seeding, we got a really warm spell and we got very moist, and we think a lot of those seeds did germinate, and then we got lost over the winter. So you're sort of fighting the weather a lot with this sort of project. Again, you sort of never really know necessarily what the seed bank's going to be like. So if you have aggressive weeds, that could create challenges, might require more management. You also have the option of how you select the mix. So we used a fairly diverse mix, and it's sort of a hedge bedding strategy to help, assuming that something was going to come up. But you could choose a simpler mix of more reliable species that are easier to grow as a different strategy. The idea is to basically have flowers that are going to bloom at different periods, that you always have sort of food and support for those different beneficial insects. So something that's going to bloom relatively early, something that's going to bloom sort of midsummer, and then something later on towards the fall. Our mix was a sort of a mixture of annuals, some tame perennials, and a few natives where we could get them. So we sort of teamed up in part with there was a project by the Xerces Society in Cheerios that helped provide some native perennials to our project, and then a lot of the other seeds we got from Imperial Seeds. And if anyone wants to see that mix, I sort of tagged it on to the end of the project, end of the slideshow, sorry. So again, how you sort of choose to seed or how you time your seed can sort of have an effect on how well it works. But then the other key is just to keep an eye on it and mow it when it needs to get mowed, and just make sure it's taken care of. But sometimes, for various reasons, it works really well, and sometimes it's less successful. The other thing is you have to be sometimes a little bit patient. Sometimes it doesn't immediately show itself. So this is one of our strips here. So this sort of a green sort of mix of plants in between the sort of crops. But then later on in the summer, this is what it looked like. So this was one of our definitely more successful plant strips. So we have a sort of a mix of phacelia and sunflowers and different things growing here. And so this is going to provide a lot of different resources for beneficial insects to sort of support that biodiversity, and then hopefully spill over into the crop and get those ecological and economic benefits. So closing points, I mean, this really is simple. I mean, you have to be patient with this sort of thing if you want to try to implement it. Take your time preparing the site. You're not necessarily going to expect to see something really big and beautiful immediately, especially if you're using sort of perennial plants. They might take time to establish and sort of grow. So you're just going to have to, you know, watch it and sort of manage your expectations. And then the simplest thing is, you know, if you want to help these beneficial insects, you know, planting flowers where you can, maintaining habitat where you can, give them some space. And then, you know, for an organic crowd, you know, there's probably not too many dangerous insecticides being applied, but you're just trying to limit any sort of measures that are going to harm those insects, or at least create these sort of habitats for them to avoid any sort of negative effects of agriculture. If people have interest in this, there's all sorts of different resources. A really great one is the Xerces Society website. So that's about 3 down. They have plant guides for different regions. So they have one for the upper Midwest of the US, but it sort of includes the southern sort of prairies. And this is one that I was involved with, which is mostly focused on sort of fruit crops, but uses a lot of native prairie plants. So I'll try to share that later with the group. And if anyone has any questions, I'll try to address them. Thanks.
All right, that was really really great. And one thing with organic producers as well, I know that at the beginning of the webinar we quoted the bit of the standard that talks about eco acres or you know, including bioacres in your farm plan, but also what's required in the organic standard is to maintain buffer strips wherever your land edges up against non-organic land, and that is an 8-meter requirement. So for me, you know, these sorts of conversations are also related to that. So rather than, you know, if you could put a buffer strip into, you know, a pollinator, you know, a habitat or a shelter belt, you know, there's multiple, you know, benefits to doing that. So for me, the more we can bring this kind of information or make it accessible to our farmers, you know, the better. So I really appreciate that. And the one question I did get was around where to source seed, and you had answered that in your presentation a little further on. So just again, thank you so much, Jason, for being here. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so
even better seed mixes.
Yeah, so this is sort of the mix that we sort of initially applied, and I think imperial seeds actually sort of, at least for the domesticated perennials and annuals, I think they sort of sell a mix based on this. So they sort of provided some of the seed, they sort of donated it, but then I think they also provide that as an option. So if you just want to use what we used. There are some plants that are more aggressive than others. So things like chicory and alfalfa are a little bit more likely to dominate. So you can sort of fluctuate the seed numbers depending on what you'd like to see.
Yeah, and also the other thing that just popped into my head is around, like, you know, the ecosystem view of your own farm, right? So connecting all of the dots in a sense. So the beneficial insects and you know, the positive impact that they have, not only, you know, like you were mentioning, the predator pollinators who, you know, go after the pests, but they also, you know, may help reduce that seed, you know, the weed seed bank, right? So there's just, you know, it is a, you know, farms are really complex ecosystems, all in, of themselves. And I think information like yourself and that you've presented and Colin has presented, I think for me, allows us maybe to take a step back and look at the farm, almost from a helicopter view, or looking up, looking down onto the farm. So, obviously those annual crops and is important, but how, by introducing all of these other things onto your farm, the potential positive impact that could have on yield. Like you said, as long as, neutral is the goal, but chances are pretty good. The more practices like this you do, the more soil health, agronomic practices you introduce, the net benefit there's going to be there for yield and other benefits on your farm. So, ooh, look, I have a question. So just hang on 1 second, or a comment anyway. Oh no, sorry, Deb was just sharing. That's great. Deb has shared some of the links that you've provided both of you have provided in your presentation, and Deb will also include those in the email that she sends out after today. So that brings us to the end, Jason, of the webinar. So thank you again so much for being here and sharing your research, and Colin as well. And just before we go, I have a few slides that I'm going to go through, which is, obviously the thank you to our speakers. Thank you for all those who attended, reminding you that you will receive a link to this live webinar within a day. And there'll be a short survey after the webinar, and we would be so grateful if you would answer it. It helps us plan future webinars. Thank you again to our gold sponsors, Grain Millers and ProCert, and our bronze sponsors, the Organic Crop Improvement Association International and Weed Surfer. And just to remind you of some upcoming events, so on Monday we have a green manures webinar with having that east to west findings presentations from Dr. Derek Lynch, Dr. Carolyn Marshall from Dalhousie University, and then Dr. Martin Entz from the University of Manitoba. And also to remind folks that we have a monthly on-farm organic research agronomy call. So we would encourage you to come along to that. And it's an opportunity to ask Dunling Wang, who is our alternative cropping specialist in the province, any questions you may have. And he's also doing presentations on various topics at those meetings as well. And then if you've missed any of our past webinar recordings, you can purchase those at our store on our website. And also Advancing Organics, which we held online in March, that is also available for you to purchase access to that. And there are 8 session recordings with the question and answers, and 39 exhibitors in the virtual exhibit hall. So we would encourage you to check that out as well. And that's it for us today. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for presenting, and hope to see you at our next webinar on June 28th. Have a great day.